Have you ever spent years trying to become part of a family, only to realize you were the only one treating it like a family in the first place? Looking back now, I don't think my story began on the day everything fell apart. I think it began on one of the quietest mornings of my life. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 43 years old, and for the last 8 years, I've been married to my husband, Ethan. He owns a landscaping company, and after we got married, I gradually stepped away from full-time counseling to help with the business whenever he needed me. It wasn't a sacrifice I regretted, at least not back then. That particular Tuesday morning felt almost ordinary. The sky was pale blue, the roads were quiet, and I was driving Ethan's mother, Margaret Brooks, to her routine cardiology appointment. Margaret was 74, a widow, and despite her age, she still insisted on watering every flower in her garden herself whenever her knees allowed it. She sat in the passenger seat with a small notebook resting on her lap, while I kept one eye on the road and the other on the dashboard clock. "I think the white hydrangeas are finally blooming." She looked out the window. "The white ones bloomed last week. Today you're going to see the pink coneflowers. The hydrangeas are beside the mailbox." She looked at me. "You remembered." "I remember because you told me 3 times." She chuckled softly. "Well, someone has to." I reached into the cup holder and handed her a small bottle of water. "Take this after your blood pressure pill, not before." She raised one eyebrow. "You're worse than my doctor." "No," I teased. "Your doctor only sees you every few months. I see you every week." People often assumed she was my mother, and sometimes they apologized after finding out she was actually my mother-in-law. We never bothered correcting them quickly, because if I'm being honest, the relationship felt closer to mother and daughter than anything else. It simply grew one quiet morning at a time. As we pulled into the medical center parking lot, Margaret looked over at me. "You didn't have to take the morning off." "I know. You've already done enough this week." "I haven't done enough until you promise not to argue with your cardiologist today." She rolled her eyes. "I only argue when he's wrong." "You argue when he tells you to eat less pie." "Exactly." Those little conversations became some of my favorite memories, because ordinary moments are usually where love quietly lives. After her appointment, we stopped by a small local cafe before heading home. Margaret always ordered hot tea, while I always ordered coffee. She liked sitting near the window where she could watch people walking by. She had a habit of inventing little stories about strangers, pretending she could guess their deepest secrets just by looking at them. At the time, I thought she was talking about strangers. Years later, I realized she had been talking about family. When we finally arrived back at her house, I helped carry her small shopping bag inside. Margaret's home had been in the Brooks family for over 40 years. It wasn't a mansion, it wasn't even particularly large, but every room carried memories. Family photographs lined the hallway. Ethan's childhood height marks were still penciled onto the kitchen doorway. The old porch swing creaked every time the wind blew. It felt lived in. It felt loved. As I stood on the front porch getting ready to leave, I looked back at the house for a moment. Margaret followed my eyes. "You know, Claire, a house doesn't belong to the person whose name is on the paperwork." I waited for her to finish. "It belongs to the person who keeps the light on." I nodded, hugging her goodbye, and drove away. Years later, I finally understood what she really meant. People often ask when Margaret and I became close. I never know how to answer that. There wasn't one unforgettable conversation, no dramatic moment that suddenly made us family. It just happened through hundreds of tiny moments that nobody else ever seemed to notice. The second year after Ethan and I married, I noticed Margaret became unusually quiet during one particular week in November. I looked at the calendar, did some digging, and realized it was the anniversary of her late husband's passing. The next morning, I asked if she'd like some company to the cemetery. She looked up, completely surprised. "You remembered?" "Of course," I told her. We brought fresh flowers. She spent almost 20 minutes talking softly to the headstone while I stayed several steps behind because some conversations belong only to the people having them. When she finished, she just squeezed my hand before we walked back to the car. She never had to explain why that mattered. I understood. Then there was the old porch swing. One spring afternoon, I noticed it was leaning slightly to one side. Margaret smiled when she caught me looking at it. "Ethan's grandfather built that swing," she said. "It needs tightening, but I've been saying that for 3 years." The next Saturday, I went to the hardware store, bought new chains, and spent the afternoon repairing it. When I finally sat down to test it, Margaret laughed from the doorway. "Richard would have approved." "I'll take that as a compliment," I smiled. "It is," she nodded. That porch swing stayed in the family because someone kept fixing it before it completely broke. I suppose families work the same way. We fell into our own quiet rhythm. Every afternoon around 3 o'clock, Margaret drank tea. She hated it boiling hot, saying it burned away the flavor. So I developed a habit. I'd boil the water, pour it into her favorite blue mug, and wait exactly 4 minutes before carrying it into the living room. One afternoon, she looked up from her crossword puzzle, took the mug, and smiled. "You remembered." "I always do." Those 2 words became the heartbeat of our life together. You remembered. Not because I had a perfect memory, but because when someone matters to you, you notice the little things. Meanwhile, life inside the rest of the family followed a very different rhythm. My husband, Ethan, was a good man, but he worked long hours running his landscaping company. He left before sunrise and often came home after dark. He loved providing for us. That was how he understood love. But sometimes I wondered if he realized that just being present was another way of providing. Then there was Olivia, Ethan's daughter. She was 15 when I married her father, and now she was 23. People later described her as cold toward me, but distance is a better word. She was never openly cruel, she just kept me outside a door she never unlocked. Years later, I learned that when Olivia was little, she overheard a relative say, "Your dad has a new family now." An adult hears change, but a child hears replacement. Somewhere in her young heart, she decided that if her father had a new family, then I must have taken the place where her mother belonged. I never blamed her for that. The misunderstanding simply grew older alongside her. One quiet evening, after I had driven home, Margaret sat alone at her kitchen table. She pulled out a worn notebook, one I had never paid attention to. She opened it carefully, wrote down the date at the top of a fresh page, and then wrote one simple sentence: "Claire repaired Grandpa Richard's porch swing today." She closed the notebook, slid it gently into the kitchen drawer, and never mentioned it to me. At the time, I had no idea she had been doing that for years. People sometimes imagine that marriages fall apart because of one terrible argument. That wasn't true for mine. Looking back, I don't remember one life-changing fight. I just remember dozens of moments when my husband, Ethan, could have spoken up and chose silence instead. He was a man who hated conflict so much that he often confused keeping the peace with doing the right thing. The first time I really felt it was Thanksgiving dinner at Margaret's house. I had just finished making homemade cranberry sauce using Margaret's exact recipe. Olivia walked into the kitchen, looked at the bowl, and gave me a cold smile. "I guess everything around here has to change eventually," she said quietly. The room went completely still. I looked at Ethan, waiting. I could actually see him preparing to speak, but at the last second, he lowered his eyes and stayed silent. Someone changed the subject, and dinner continued. An insult from someone who doesn't love you hurts, but silence from the person who is supposed to have your back hurts even more. Months later, it was Olivia's 23rd birthday. I wanted it to feel special, so Margaret and I spent days planning. I ordered her favorite chocolate raspberry cake, decorated the backyard with warm string lights, and framed an old photo of Ethan and her. Neighbors and cousins arrived, and Margaret looked happier than she had in weeks. But when Olivia finally walked into the backyard, she didn't greet anyone. She just locked eyes with me, turned right around, got back into her car, and drove away. The music kept playing, but the celebration was over. Ethan walked over and gently touched my shoulder. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "She just needs more time." I looked at him, completely exhausted. 8 years isn't enough? He didn't answer. A few weeks later, birthdays and hurt feelings didn't matter anymore. Margaret was rushed to the hospital with severe chest pain. I threw my things in the car and drove straight there. She was kept overnight for observation, so I stayed by her side, adjusting her blankets and writing down every medication the nurses mentioned. Ethan arrived around 7 that evening. He hugged his mother, spoke with the doctor, and then his phone rang. When he came back into the room, he looked stressed. "I've got a client meeting first thing tomorrow. I really should get some sleep. You'll stay?" I forced a smile. Of course. He kissed my forehead and left. I watched him walk down the hallway, wishing that leaving us had been a little bit harder for him. Around 2 in the morning, the hospital room was dead quiet, except for the steady beep of the heart monitor. Margaret opened her eyes and saw me sitting in the chair beside her bed. "You should go home," she whispered. "So should you," I replied. She smiled weakly, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "You've always been stubborn." "I learned from you," I said. The next morning, Ethan returned to take us home. He thanked me for staying, and he truly meant it. That was the most confusing part. He appreciated everything I did, but he never understood what his absence actually cost. As we pulled into the driveway, Margaret watched Ethan carry her overnight bag toward the front door. She looked at her son for a long, heavy moment, and then she let out the softest, most heartbroken sigh I had ever heard. And somehow that quiet sigh hurt more than any words she could have said. Every family has a tradition they tell themselves will never change. For Ethan's family, it was Margaret's annual summer barbecue. Every July, the backyard filled with strings of warm lights and the laughter of relatives and neighbors. For years, I believed that day represented the best version of our family. Now I know sometimes the brightest afternoons hide the longest shadows. Like every other year, I arrived first. Margaret had barely finished watering the flowers when I pulled into her driveway. She smiled the moment she saw my car. "I knew you'd beat everyone. I wanted to help." "You always do." After 8 years, we had developed our own quiet rhythm. We checked the grocery list together, and without a single word of instruction, we got to work. She seasoned the potato salad, I washed the vegetables, and while she arranged flowers for the tables, I hung the string lights around the fence. Around mid-morning, Ethan arrived, carrying coolers filled with meat for the grill. He kissed me on the cheek. "Looks like you're already halfway finished." "Someone has to keep us on schedule," I laughed. "I'll handle the grill," he smiled, "and you'll handle everything else." It wasn't a complaint, it had simply become our routine. Ethan truly believed that if nobody was actively arguing, then everything must be perfectly okay. By noon, cars began pulling into the driveway. One of the first to arrive was Ethan's cousin, Linda. She was someone I genuinely enjoyed being around because she noticed things other people overlooked. The moment she walked into the backyard, she spotted me carrying a heavy stack of plates. "Claire, I should have known," she laughed gently. I shrugged. Everyone has their part to play. Linda shook her head, lowering her voice so only I could hear. "Maybe, but somehow your part always seems bigger than everyone else's." I laughed it off. Helping never felt like a burden to me. It felt like belonging. Throughout the afternoon, I moved from one small task to another, refilling drinks, replacing empty trays, and checking on Margaret whenever she looked tired. Margaret watched all of it. Sometimes I'd catch her looking at me from across the yard, with an expression I couldn't quite understand. There was gratitude in her eyes, but something else too. almost like concern, as though she were seeing a storm I couldn't yet see. Then Olivia arrived, looking effortless in a white summer dress. She hugged her grandmother, kissed Ethan, and when she reached me, she offered a brief, guarded smile. "Hi, Claire." "Hi, Olivia. I'm glad you made it. Traffic wasn't too bad." Our conversation ended right there. As the afternoon went on, the distance between us felt heavier. When I asked whether she'd like lemonade or iced tea, she answered lemonade without even looking at me. When I offered her a fresh plate, she quietly said, "I'm fine," and immediately walked away to join another conversation. None of these moments were openly rude, but tension isn't always created by a big fight. Sometimes it's built from 100 tiny rejections that all lean in the same direction. Linda noticed it too. She walked over to the serving table and asked quietly, "You okay?" I forced a smile. "Of course." She studied my face for a second, then simply nodded, letting it go. Across the backyard, Ethan was laughing with his uncles as smoke drifted lazily above the grill. Olivia stood with a group of cousins, but every so often I'd catch her glaring in my direction before quickly looking away. To anyone walking past the house, we looked like the picture of a perfect family, enjoying a beautiful summer afternoon. But standing right in the middle of it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something invisible had begun to shift. Sometimes your heart notices a storm long before your eyes can see the clouds.
People often ask me what finally broke our family. They expect a dramatic betrayal, some shocking secret. But the truth is, it was a few drops of lemonade. That's all. Looking back, I know the lemonade wasn't the real problem. It was simply the moment that exposed everything none of us had been willing to say out loud. The afternoon barbecue had been going exactly as it always did, with music drifting through the speakers and everyone eating. I was carrying a large tray with fresh corn and several glasses of homemade lemonade toward the patio. As I stepped around one of the picnic tables, Olivia turned unexpectedly. Neither of us saw each other in time. My shoulder lightly brushed against hers, a glass tipped, and a small splash of lemonade landed across the front of her white summer dress. Just a few drops. I froze. "Oh my goodness, Olivia, I'm so sorry. It was an accident." I reached for a clean napkin, honestly believing that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Olivia stared down at the wet spots, her breathing uneven. Then she looked directly at me, and something inside her seemed to break. "You always do this," she said. Her voice wasn't loud yet, just exhausted. I blinked. "What?" "You always find a way to insert yourself into everything." Several conversations nearby stopped. I lowered the napkin, but she took a step back, her voice suddenly echoing across the yard. "I don't need you apologizing to me. For 8 years, you've acted like you belong here." Every head turned. The children stopped running. I tried to speak calmly. "I've never tried to take anyone's place." Olivia laughed, her hands shaking. "You don't get it, do you? You have never been my family, and you never will be." The words landed harder than I expected. The whole yard went dead silent. I stood there, looking at the young woman I'd spent 8 years trying not to pressure, not to replace her mother. For the first time, I realized nothing I had done had ever reached her. Before I could answer, Ethan's cousin Linda stepped forward. "Olivia, that's enough. I mean it." Nobody had ever spoken to Olivia like that before. For a hopeful second, I thought someone would finally stand up for what was right. Then Ethan walked towards us. My heart actually relaxed. This was the moment I'd imagined so many times over the years. He looked at Olivia, then he looked at me. I watched him hesitate. I knew that look. He wanted everyone to calm down. He wanted peace. Finally, he looked at me and spoke. "Claire, just apologize. If you apologize, this will settle down." I stared at him, searching his face, wondering if I had misunderstood. He just waited, expecting me to fix the situation the same way I always had. I looked down at the tiny drops of lemonade, then back at Ethan. I wasn't angry, and I wasn't crying. Something inside me had become unexpectedly calm. I asked him one simple question. "Do you really believe I'm the one who needs to apologize?" Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Olivia, he looked at the ground, but he never answered, and his silence told me everything I needed to know. I slowly untied my apron, folded it neatly, and set it on the table. No dramatic gestures, no raised voice. I walked into the kitchen and picked up my car keys. As I came back out, Margaret stood up from her chair beneath the tree. Our eyes met across the yard. She didn't try to stop me. I think she understood that something had ended. Linda lowered her head. I walked across the driveway, climbed into my car, and started the engine. As I drove away, I looked once in the rearview mirror. The tables, the lights, the family, everything looked exactly the same. But I knew I had just driven away from something much bigger than a summer party. For the first time in 8 years, I stopped trying to earn a place where I was never allowed to belong.
I didn't drive back to the house Ethan and I shared. There wasn't any anger behind that decision, only clarity. When we got married, I kept the small one-bedroom apartment I owned across town. I hadn't spent a night there in years, but my hands knew exactly where to drive. Everything looked just as I left it. The old blue sofa, the dust on the windowsill. I sat on the edge of the couch, and for the first time all afternoon, the silence felt honest. I replayed the barbecue over and over in my mind. Olivia's harsh words were painful, but I could understand her fear of replacement. What I couldn't stop hearing was Ethan's voice. "Claire, just apologize." Every difficult moment in our marriage ended the same way. Someone else created the wound, and I was expected to become the bandage. My phone remained silent for almost an hour. Ethan didn't call, but just after 6 o'clock, it rang. It was Daniel Ross, Margaret's attorney. I had only met him twice. His voice was calm and professional. "Claire, I've just spoken with Margaret. She asked me to call you. She's physically fine, but she'd like to see you tonight at my office." He didn't mention paperwork or property, just one sentence. "Margaret wants to see you." Less than an hour later, I parked outside the dark office building. Daniel led me into a lit conference room, and the moment I saw Margaret, I forgot every question I had. She looked emotionally exhausted. As I sat beside her, she reached out and grabbed my hand. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. I shook my head. "You don't have anything to apologize for." "Oh, Claire, I do." Daniel quietly closed the door to give us privacy. Margaret took a slow, steady breath. 3 years ago, I asked Daniel to help me create a living trust. I wasn't planning for my death. I was planning for your future. I stared at her, completely confused. "My future?" She nodded. "I knew a day would come when your heart simply couldn't carry any more. I watched you for years. You gave this family everything. You never demanded to be called Olivia's mother. You never made Ethan choose. And you never complained when you stayed up all night with me in the hospital. You simply kept loving people who didn't know how to love you back." Tears began to blur my vision. Margaret smiled sadly. "I should have spoken sooner. Every time Olivia pushed you away, I told myself she would grow out of it. Every time Ethan stayed quiet, I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere." She covered her face, her voice barely audible. "I thought I was protecting my son, but all I really protected was his silence." I couldn't stop crying, not because I blamed her, but because I knew how heavy those words were. I wrapped my arms around her. "No, you loved him. I know why you hoped things would get better." She leaned against my shoulder. I failed you. No, I held her tighter. You didn't. You were the only person who truly ever saw me. We sat there for several minutes, just two women mourning 8 years of hope, hope that kindness alone would eventually heal the wounds that silence kept reopening. When we finally pulled apart, Margaret wiped her eyes and managed a small, weary smile. So, will you let me explain why I created that living trust? I nodded quietly. For the first time that evening, I was ready to listen. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The conference room was completely quiet. Daniel sat across the table, giving Margaret and me the time we needed. He understood that whatever happened next wasn't really about legal documents. It was about 8 years of a life that had finally reached its turning point. Margaret slowly reached into the leather bag beside her chair. "I've been carrying something," she said softly. "I think it's finally time for you to see it." She pulled out an old, worn navy blue notebook and gently placed it on the table between us. Daniel folded his hands before speaking. "Claire, before Margaret shows you what's inside, there's something important you need to understand. The living trust Margaret created 3 years ago was never designed as a reward or a punishment. The trust exists because Margaret believes only one person in this family truly understands what a home actually is. She believes that person is you." I immediately shook my head. "No, I never wanted anyone's house." Margaret reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "I know. That's exactly why I trusted you." Daniel looked directly at me. "Margaret believes a home isn't defined by whose name appears on a deed. It's defined by the person who quietly protects it, cares for the people inside, and keeps it alive through ordinary acts of love." Suddenly, I remembered that afternoon months ago on her front porch when she smiled and told me, "A house doesn't belong to the person whose name is on the paperwork. It belongs to the person who keeps the light on." At the time, I thought it was just a beautiful thought. Now I realized she had already made her decision. Margaret slowly opened the notebook. "There are more than 200 pages," she whispered, carefully turning to one of the earliest entries. Her voice trembled as she read aloud. "October 18th. Claire stayed with me until almost 2 in the morning because I couldn't sleep after a difficult doctor's appointment. She read to me until I finally fell asleep. You thought I had forgotten." I whispered, "I didn't think it mattered." She looked at me, tears in her eyes. "It mattered." She turned the page. "February 4th. Claire quietly replaced the batteries in my hearing aids. She never mentioned doing it. She just handed them back so I wouldn't feel embarrassed." I covered my mouth. I barely even remember doing that. To me, it had just been another ordinary afternoon. Margaret kept turning pages, reading the dates. One page read, "Claire noticed I was shivering and quietly brought me a blanket before anyone else realized I was cold." Another said, "She remembered Richard's anniversary without anyone reminding her, and today she repaired his old porch swing." Page after page, year after year, tiny, ordinary kindnesses that the world almost always forgets. Except Margaret hadn't forgotten a single one. I looked up at her through my tears. "You've been keeping this all these years?" She smiled warmly. "At first, I was afraid my memory would fade. Then I realized I wasn't just recording what you did, Claire. I was recording who you were." I couldn't stop crying. Honestly, by that point, I'd completely forgotten we were sitting in a lawyer's office. This notebook was worth more than any property she could ever leave behind. For 8 years, I had quietly wondered if anything I did actually mattered, if anyone truly noticed. Now I had my answer. Someone had witnessed everything. Daniel waited until the room grew quiet again. Every entry in this notebook pointed to the same conclusion, Claire. Margaret didn't choose the future caretaker of her home out of obligation. She chose the person who had already been caring for it for years. I lowered my eyes. I never thought of myself that way. Margaret smiled with a tenderness that felt completely maternal. I know, dear. That's exactly why I knew I could trust you. She squeezed my hand tightly. This time, she wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was offering me proof. Proof that quiet love had never been invisible. It had just been witnessed by the one person who understood its true value all along. People sometimes think regret arrives all at once. It doesn't. Real regret comes quietly. It hides inside ordinary moments, waiting until the person who used to carry everything is suddenly gone. After I left the barbecue, I didn't hear much from Ethan for several days. For the first time in 8 years, silence belonged to both of us. Later, Ethan told me what those days had been like. And honestly, it wasn't my absence that changed him. It was everything my absence revealed. Because someone still had to take care of Margaret, and for the first time in years, that someone became him. The first surprise came only 2 mornings after the barbecue. Margaret asked him for her blood pressure medication. Ethan walked into the kitchen and opened the medicine cabinet, expecting to find random bottles. Instead, he found rows of neatly organized containers, each carrying a small handwritten note: morning, lunch, evening, take with food. Every note was written in the same familiar handwriting, mine. He later admitted he stood there for a full minute without touching anything. He had never noticed those notes before, simply because someone else had always handled them. Later that afternoon, Margaret mentioned her upcoming doctor's appointment. Ethan frowned. "I'll call tomorrow and schedule one." Margaret looked confused. "It already is scheduled, Ethan. It's been scheduled for months." He opened the family calendar hanging beside the refrigerator, a calendar he had walked past for years without really looking. Now he stopped. Every single square was filled with my careful handwriting: cardiology, eye exam, prescription refill. Every appointment carried the same small initials in the corner: CB. Ethan slowly turned the pages backward. The previous month, the month before that, the year before. Every calendar looked the same, perfectly planned. He later told me, "I always thought life just worked." Only after I left did he realize someone had been quietly making it work. A few days later, another discovery waited for him. Margaret asked him if he could find the receipt for the porch swing repairs. He opened the kitchen drawer, finding neatly sorted folders for home maintenance and utilities. He found the receipt, but something else caught his attention: a stack of invoices for the plumber, the electrician, and a new water heater. One by one, he turns them over. Paid, paid, paid. Attached to them were copies of canceled checks, not from our joint account, but from my personal savings. He asked Margaret quietly, "Claire paid for all of these?" Margaret looked at her son for a long, heavy moment. She said the house needed them. "Why didn't she tell me?" "Did you ever ask?" Margaret countered. He didn't answer, because he couldn't. Olivia began to notice things too, simply because of the emptiness I left behind. She stopped by one evening after work to visit her grandmother. Usually, I would have been there, the living room warm and tea already waiting. Instead, the house felt strangely quiet. Olivia looked around. "Where's the tea?" Margaret smiled gently. "I forgot to make it." Olivia hesitated. She didn't say the words out loud, but both of them knew I never forgot. A few minutes later, Margaret struggled to hear their conversation. Normally, I checked her hearing aid batteries every few weeks without saying a word. This time, the batteries had died, and they didn't have any spares. As they drove to the pharmacy together, Olivia quietly asked, "Did Claire usually keep extras?" Margaret nodded. "In the kitchen drawer." Olivia looked out the window, whispering softly, "I never noticed." Margaret simply answered, "Most people don't notice the things that are done every day."
As the days passed, they didn't find a shocking confession or a hidden letter. Instead, they found dozens of ordinary acts of care. Sometimes the loudest proof that someone loved you isn't found in what they said. It's found in everything that quietly stops happening after they're gone.
A week after my meeting with Margaret and Daniel, life became strangely quiet. No angry phone calls, no legal threats. One Monday morning, Daniel called me with the calm certainty of someone explaining a final decision. "Claire, the living trust has officially gone into effect," he said. "Margaret remains the primary resident. No one is losing their home, but the trust names you as co-trustee alongside her." I had expected him to say beneficiary. Instead, he used a word that meant something completely different. "What does that actually mean?" I asked. "It means responsibility, not ownership," Daniel explained simply. "If repairs are needed or financial matters arise, decisions are made together. The purpose isn't to take the home away from anyone, it's to protect the home and Margaret's wishes for the future. She never wanted this house to become something people fought over." After we hung up, I sat alone in my apartment. A house belongs to the person who keeps the light on. For the first time, I truly understood. Margaret wasn't giving me a trophy or a prize. She was giving me a stewardship, trusting me to protect a place where people could still find peace. A few days later, Ethan called. His voice didn't sound desperate or defensive anymore, just tired. "Would you meet me?" he asked. "Where?" "The coffee shop on Maple Street, at 3. When I arrived, Ethan was already sitting by the window. We didn't hug, we just sat down across from each other. He looked emotionally drained. The waitress brought our drinks, but neither of us touched them. Ethan finally broke the silence. "I know about the trust. I'm not here because of the house, Claire, and I'm not asking you to change anything." He lowered his eyes, his voice cracking. "I've spent the last week seeing things I should have noticed years ago. The notes on Mom's medicine, the calendar, the repair bills. I honestly believed life just happened. I never realized you were the one quietly holding everything together." I didn't interrupt. He deserved to finish. "I kept thinking I was avoiding conflict," he said, a sad smile crossing his face. "But all I was really doing was asking you to carry it instead. I'm so sorry." Those words hung between us, and I believed he truly meant them. For the first time, Ethan wasn't making excuses or blaming his daughter. He was just telling the truth. He looked at me with tears in his eyes. "I don't expect you to forgive me today. I just needed you to know I finally understand." I reached across the table and gently rested my hand on his. Kindness didn't have to disappear just because a marriage had become impossible to live inside. "Ethan, I never left because I stopped loving you. I left because I spent too many years living without being respected. Love can survive mistakes, but it cannot survive being asked over and over to become smaller so everyone else can stay comfortable." A tear rolled down his cheek. He nodded slowly. "I know. I wish I had understood that sooner." "So do I replied. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no promise to start over. When we finally stood to leave, Ethan quietly thanked me and I wished him well. As I walked back to my car and drove away, I realized something unexpected. For the first time in years, I wasn't driving away because I felt rejected. I was driving toward a life where I finally understood my own worth. And somehow, that felt like home than any house ever could. Exactly 1 year passed. People often imagine grief arrives like a thunderstorm, but in my experience, it arrives more like winter, quietly and slowly, until one day you realize the world has become colder. Margaret passed away on a peaceful Sunday morning. She was 75. She died in her own bedroom, in the home she had loved for more than 40 years. According to Ethan, she had fallen asleep before sunrise and simply never woke up. There was comfort in knowing she hadn't been afraid. She had always said that if she ever had the chance to choose, she wanted her final morning to begin exactly where so many ordinary mornings had begun, at home. The funeral was simple, just as Margaret had requested. Family, close friends, neighbors, and people from church gathered, but there were no grand speeches. I sat a few rows behind Ethan and Olivia, not because anyone asked me to, it simply felt right. Some relationships change, but respect doesn't have to. After the service ended, Daniel Ross approached the family. Over the past year, he had become more than Margaret's attorney. He was the person entrusted with carrying out her final wishes. He held a sealed envelope in his hand. Across the front, written in Margaret's familiar handwriting, were only a few words: "To my family." Daniel looked at Ethan and said, "Margaret asked that this be read after today's service." The room became completely silent as he unfolded the letter. "My dear family," Daniel read, "if you're hearing these words, then I finally get to stop worrying about all of you. I know some of you may still have questions about the decisions I made, so let me answer the one I imagine will be asked most often. If anyone asks why I entrusted my home to Claire, tell them it was never because she asked for it. She never did. Tell them it was never because I loved my son or granddaughter any less. I never could." Daniel paused, his voice softening as he read the next lines. "Tell them that Claire was the only person who never treated this place like a piece of property. She always treated it like a home. A house can be bought, but a home must be cared for. For 8 years, Claire kept the porch light on, whether anyone thanked her or not. That is why I trusted her." No one spoke. Margaret had already said everything that mattered. When Daniel finished, he folded the letter and quietly stepped away. For several long moments, everyone remained frozen. Then I heard footsteps approaching. I looked up to see Olivia standing in front of me, her eyes swollen from crying. For the first time since I had known her, she wasn't hiding behind distance. She looked frightened, not of me, but of everything she finally understood. "Claire," her voice barely rose above a whisper, "I don't know where to begin. I spent years believing you were trying to replace my mom, but I know now that you never were. I kept holding on to something I heard when I was a little girl. When people said Dad had a new family, I thought that meant there wasn't room for my old one anymore. I blamed the wrong person." Tears rolled freely down her face. "I'm not sorry because of the house. I'm sorry because I wasted 8 years that I can never get back." Those words hurt more than any insult she had ever spoken, because they were true. Without thinking, I stepped forward and hugged her. She cried against my shoulder like a child carrying something far too heavy for far too long. "I forgive you," I whispered. "Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it just refuses to let the past decide the future." A few feet away, Ethan watched quietly. He didn't interrupt, and he didn't ask for another chance. Some stories don't end with people getting back together. Sometimes they end with people finally becoming honest. Several months later, after the legal process was complete, I moved into Margaret's house. Every room still carried her laughter, her favorite blue teacup still sat beside the kettle, and Richard's porch swing still creaked gently in the evening breeze. I simply became its next caretaker. Before marrying Ethan, I had spent years working as a school counselor, and helping people had always been the work that made me feel most alive. So I turned Margaret's old sewing room into a support group. Every Wednesday evening, women going through divorce, family rejection, or painful life transitions gathered around the same table where Margaret and I had once shared tea. There were no fees or expectations, just coffee, conversation, and a place where nobody had to pretend they were stronger than they felt. Sometimes healing begins with advice, but more often it begins with being heard. One evening, after everyone had gone home, I walked onto the front porch. The sun had already disappeared below the trees, and the yard was dead quiet.
I reached beside the front door and switched on the porch light, watching the warm glow spread across the steps. For a moment, I closed my eyes, remembering Margaret and the words she used to say. As I looked out at that single light shining into the darkness, I smiled. Not because I had inherited a house, but because after all those years, I had finally found a place where I belonged.